Welcome back to Normalized PTSD. Apologies for having a few weeks with no episodes. Life's busy. Got excuses for days, but I'll just try to do better. Today, I really enjoyed this episode. It's about microdosing with LSD and psilocybin and what that means. Today, we have Dr. Zelfand, and I really enjoyed this. I think my favorite part would definitely be about the 1A and 2A receptors and what that means. Without any more delays, here you go. Have a good one. All right. Today we have Dr. Zelfand. Thank you so much for taking the time to join the podcast and talk about microdosing.
Oh, it's my pleasure and one of my favorite topics. I'm glad to be here.
So today we're going to discuss microdosing. I was hoping you could break down just what that is.
Yeah. Well, microdosing means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So I think it's great that we define the terms. So when we talk about microdosing within the context of certain psychoactive substances, such as most commonly psilocybin or LSD, can also be with ketamine and ibogaine and other psychedelic drugs as well. When we talk about microdosing, we're talking about, as the name implies, taking an exquisitely small dose of something, not an amount that is going to make you hallucinate or alter your ability to function in your day-to-day life. Some people say it's a subperceptive dose, and other people say, well, if it was subperceptive, why would you even bother? So it's somewhere between subperceptive and other people prefer to say subhallucinogenic with no loss of functionality, i.e. it's taking a very small dose of a substance to help you in your day-to-day life without disrupting your day-to-day life or requiring breaks from your day-to-day life.
Awesome. So you're not going to meet the higher beings by taking a microdose.
Probably not. No, if your face starts melting and you're channeling Ramtha, that was not a microdose.
Awesome. So microdose, like how much? And is there like a schedule, like how often you would take a microdose?
Mm-hmm. So it's like there are as many microdosers as there are microdosing regimens. So I'll say microdosing is an incredibly new field, relatively speaking, for psychiatry and for physical health. And so that is being researched right now on what even is a microdose. So typically, now ask me again in 5-10 years, and the answer might be very different. But right now, our definition of a microdose is somewhere between a 20th and 1/10 of a recreational dose of a substance. So typically for something like LSD, we're talking about somewhere around 5, maybe 10 micrograms of LSD. There was a study done suggesting that the cutoff be 13 as our higher limit, 13 micrograms for our upper limit if we're calling it a microdose. And then for psilocybin-containing mushrooms, if we're weighing out the mushrooms, somewhere around 1/10 of a gram to maybe 0.4 grams. Certain sources will say up to 0.5 gram of dried mushrooms is a microdose. I know if I take 0.5 grams of dried mushrooms, I am not functioning normally. So,
Yep.
A lot of people argue 0.5 gram is probably not a microdose, but we're talking about fractions of a gram.
Right. And that brings up a point to me. I've had friends who have taken mushrooms and it has a different effect to them than me, but I guess the same thing could be said with almost any substance in the world. So if you're taking a dose and you are feeling really heavy effects, then maybe back it off a little bit.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, even if it feels something like you drank too much coffee and you're just kind of revved up and you're like, wow, I'm talking kind of fast and I think I'm annoying people today. That means to back off on the dose. You shouldn't feel amped, right? But that being said, a really normal side effect, which does not mean that the dose is too high, is a sensitivity to bright lights. So if you're finding that you're wanting to wear sunglasses more often, or that you want to turn down the brightness on your phone or your computer screen, that's just a nuisance side effect, but it doesn't say much about the dose. You might be right at the sweet spot on the dose there.
Awesome. What would be some cases that microdosing might be beneficial? For example, like I've seen there's positive impact with substance abuse as well as depression, things like that.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's also a controversial question because when we look at the literature, we see some pretty mixed results in the studies. And part of this, it actually has more to do with the legality of the situation than it does of the substance itself. And what I mean by that is, in the United States, these substances that we're talking about microdosing, psilocybin, LSD, ibogaine, they are all at the federal level, they are illegal. They are Schedule 1 substances. And yet we have this explosion of research into the therapeutic value of these substances. By definition, a Schedule 1 drug means that it has no approved medical use whatsoever. It has no medical value whatsoever. It has a high potential for abuse, and it has a high potential for addiction. Now, anybody who has studied the nature and the neurochemistry of psychedelics for more than 3 minutes can tell you that these substances do not belong on the DEA's Schedule 1. They are safer than opiates. They are safer than Tylenol, actually, when you look at the negative outcomes of Tylenol. Psychedelics are safer, right? They are absolutely safer than alcohol. Also, when you look at the risk of harm to self and the harm to others, you are much more likely to harm yourself and harm other people under the effects of alcohol than under the effects of mushrooms, no matter what dose of mushrooms we're talking about.
I had someone ask me, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, please.
They asked me, why are psychedelics illegal? Like, what happened? And I kind of had the answer. You know, there's the war on drugs that started in the 60s, and they kind of got looped into there. And I just didn't really have a good answer. And I was wondering if you did.
Reagan and Nixon in a nutshell.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So, you can't. There are certain drugs that are quite nefarious and were quite harmful and disruptive to American society.
Like
and
opiates, right?
Right, like opiates, or even going back even farther than that, crack, crack epidemic, right? And wanting to get hard on drugs, as a policy, we now know, hindsight's 2020. If you want to get hard on drugs, you don't get hard on the drug users. It doesn't do anything, right? But what we did, we essentially made it a criminal activity to use drugs. It backfired horrendously. That's a topic for a whole different podcast. But what happened was a lot of these substances all got lumped together.
Right.
And if we were going to rewind even farther back, before the crack cocaine epidemic, we had in the 1960s, the Summer of Love, we have the largest anti-war protest in American history, people opposing the Vietnam War. And this was a huge threat to political stability in the United States. And what were all of these troublemaking hippies doing? They were smoking marijuana, they were taking mushrooms, they were taking LSD. And by criminalizing these substances, it made it very easy to raid homes, to shut down movements, to squash political counterculture efforts. So if you make the substances that people use illegal, it becomes a lot easier to suppress those people. And this isn't just our, peace and love hippies. This also includes Mexicans in the United States. You make marijuana illegal, you get to crack down on them. How about people of color? You make their drugs illegal, you get to raid their homes and shut down their meetings and use this as a political weapon. And I know that I may be sounding a bit conspiracy theorist here, but we actually have quotes from, for example, the advisor to President Nixon saying things like this. On record.
Recorded.
Yeah. So Yeah. I mean, I don't know if he meant it to be on record, but it's on record. And so what's happened since that time is that the American culture has really developed this stigma around these substances, in particular around LSD.
Hmm.
There was a rabble rouser by the name of Timothy Leary, former Harvard professor who was kicked out of Harvard, and he was performing these quote unquote studies on LSD, and the studies were not very scientifically rigorous. He often took LSD
Right.
along with his subjects, and his subjects were his graduate students and then his under. So, a bit of a mess was created there, and now we're going through not only a psychedelic renaissance right now, but almost like a psychedelic rebranding.
Right.
we're trying to distance ourselves from that,
Hmm.
the tie-dye t-shirt disruptive culture, and more of the like, look, we've got people in suits with graduate degrees studying these things. Can we talk about them now from a more scientifically rigorous angle?
Right. I read a
So
book.
yeah,
Sorry.
go ahead,
I read,
please.
what was it? Sacred Knowledge, I believe it was. And
Mm,
I really enjoyed how it went about it too, because it's not about the trip and it's more about the benefits of the LSD. And I think there's old studies to support that smoking cessation, substance abuse, alcoholism, it was almost 100% successful. It was very high.
hmm.
And nowadays there's studies coming out about PTSD, which kind of my passion, and it's showing
Yeah.
really high percent success rate. And it's not a short term thing. It's not like it did really well in the beginning and then after that you fade. It was like at a year the
Yeah.
benefits were getting better, and I was like, this is awesome. So I think there's
Hmm.
a lot of positive that's happening with psychedelics, and I hope the rebranding works.
Yes, me too. And to your point, that positive, it's not just after a year. For example, and a small tangent, but worth making here. In the studies where they used MDMA, which is a drug also known as ecstasy, for treating people with PTSD, what they found was not only the PTSD scores dropped so significantly that a lot of the participants actually no longer qualified for a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Isn't that awesome?
Amazing, right? That's 1 month after treatment.
Hmm.
But then when they did the follow-up 3.8 years later, almost 4 years later, those people's PTSD scores were even lower than right after the end of the treatment. So
It's amazing.
what these medicines do is they really catalyze a process that continues with the person, especially if that person continues to engage in things like therapy or exercise or healthy eating, right? If they really leverage the effects of these substances, they can get mileage that stays with them for years, possibly decades. Without ever having to take the drug ever again. And as you may imagine, that is hugely disruptive to the pharmaceutical industry.
Right.
So, so to go back to your original question, I know we went on a big tangent here, but let's see if I can stick the landing. Your question was, what does microdosing help with? And
Yes.
before I can answer that question, I have to say, here's why we don't have a lot of good studies on microdosing.
Yes.
We have drugs that the government has told us have no accepted medical use whatsoever, high risk for abuse, high risk of harm if you use them. And so trying to get studies approved on these substances is a bit of a tricky situation because the government essentially has to admit that it was wrong, right? And so it's one thing to get the government to approve a study where somebody takes a single dose of psilocybin in a doctor's office with the researcher sitting there and watching in a controlled environment.
Hmm.
And that has been approved. And actually, the NIH has even funded a study on smoking cessation. So it's happening. But it's quite a different thing to fund a study in which you send people home with a Schedule 1 substance and
Hmm.
say, I want you to take 10 micrograms of this substance every morning, and to trust the patient to do that,
Right.
and to trust them not to divert the drug, and to have them repeatedly take this quote unquote highly dangerous substance, which it isn't. But that's a completely different animal. So we do have some, and I really want to underline the word some, limited studies that are sort of these double-blind, controlled, randomized, our gold standard studies. We do have some on microdosing. But what we have even more of is what's called anecdotal evidence,
Hmm.
meaning talking to real people who have done this on their own at home, who didn't enroll in a study, who got their drugs from God knows where, who experimented on themselves, and then communicated with researchers to share what their experiences were. That is not the gold standard of research in our culture, right? Yeah. And, we kind of dismiss anecdotal evidence, but let's not forget that the word evidence exists in the phrase anecdotal evidence. It's still data, right? It's meaningful, it's full of flaws, but we can't ignore it either.
Absolutely.
So based on our lab studies, like our gold standard studies, we've shown that microdosing can help with pain tolerance, and that it can help with mood. Now, if we want to extend it farther and say, okay, what is the other data that we've garnered helped with? Creativity, choosing healthier lifestyle practices. For example, when people microdose, they tend to not feel as attracted to junk food, and they tend to feel more excited by eating vegetables. They tend to feel restless when they sit at home like a lump on a log watching Netflix. They tend to intrinsically want to get up and go for a walk. Things like that, just a natural gravitation towards healthier practices. People have also anecdotally reported that their minds wander less, which this may be the value of microdosing for somebody, say, who has an ADD or ADHD kind of a picture. Reduced substance use reports that when people are microdosing, they crave alcohol less. They find smoking cigarettes more disgusting. They don't want these more harmful substances. They just intrinsically don't want them as much. It seems to curb the use of those substances. And then we've got more data on things like, I think better, I get more work done, I'm more productive, I enjoy my interactions with other people more. Social interactions are more fruitful and enjoyable mutually. I'm more aware of my emotions, things like that.
I like it.
So yeah. So we've got a smattering of effects, but here's that. I'm forever my own negative Nancy. The effects are bidirectional, meaning that we have in some studies show microdosing increases your attention span. Other people report that when they microdose, they can't focus at all, right? Some people report that they think more clearly. Other people report that they think more muddy. The mood report is a real interesting one. Some people report that they feel that their anxiety is curbed. Other people, in particular people who have generalized anxiety disorder, they're more likely to report that they actually feel more anxious, that they feel worse when they microdose.
I could see that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Overstimulated.
It's right. It's overstimulated. And then on the point of stimulation, we typically recommend people microdose in the morning because it can be a little stimulating to take these substances. But I have seen in a number of my patients, they microdose, they feel tired and they can barely keep their eyes open. And I don't think that this is a bad thing. I think that considering the context, this was in patients who were super anxious, who had trauma histories and therefore had hypervigilance responses, and who didn't sleep well. And it was when they microdosed that some of that hypervigilance could finally turn down. And this is often what happens in people with PTSD, is that when you finally get a break from your anxiety, from your hypervigilance, from the hyperaroused state of your nervous system, you can feel how truly exhausted you actually are.
Yeah.
And there's a difference between having energy because you're excited to start the day versus you have energy because you think that you are about to be killed and you need to be ready to attack or run. Those are two very different kinds of energy.
Yeah.
And when you get a break from the latter, it's an absolutely healthy and normal and healing response to want to take a nap, to be tired, right?
Absolutely.
To rest. So I don't see the fatigue as a quote unquote negative side effect. I actually see it as the medicine working.
I agree. Yeah, my experience with psilocybin, I've never tried LSD, but it just helps me get out of my own way a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I was
Yeah.
going to ask you, what is the difference between LSD and psilocybin?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a question of like, what's the difference between Coke and Pepsi?
Right?
So, some people get real, they really draw a hard line in the sand on this one, and I'm not going to do that because I just haven't found it to be true. Some people microdose psilocybin, they feel worse, they feel more anxious, they're whatever, agitated. We lower the dose, then they feel nothing. And it's like, okay, they try LSD, completely different experience. So you kind of don't know which one is going to work for you until you try them both. Of course, I can't recommend that you do either because these are
Still
both,
illegal.
right? "Quote unquote, highly illegal
Right.
substances and you're
So
crazy, you're going to
dangerous.
break your brain, right?
Yeah.
So I would never, of course, recommend this. But anecdotally, some people who try both, they find a preference for one over the other. Some people try both and they say, I felt terrible on both, or neither
Mm.
did anything for me. And this is the bear of psychiatry. I hate saying this to patients. It is
Hmm.
absolutely true. Psychiatry is a guess and check process.
Hmm.
And that is true whether we're talking about microdosing psychedelics or if we're talking about which SSRI or which SNRI or which other drug class we're going to do for a prescription for you.
Hmm.
You try things, you give it a couple weeks, you see what works. No patient wants to hear this.
Yeah. But that's just the way it is. There's no oil check gauge for your mind.
Yeah. And I see people now, they have these genetic tests. Oh, take this genetic test and it's going to tell you which antidepressant to do. And I really robustly I fell for it and I
Mhm.
ran those genetic tests on a bunch of patients and I haven't found them to be very valuable. Um, so, and it's been a complete crapshoot for some clients. Yes, wonderful for others. Okay, this report comes back and it says that you're going to feel bad if you take Wellbutrin and that we should try Lexapro instead. And then the patient will look me in the face and say, I have never felt sicker in my life than when I took Lexapro, and the only drug I ever thought helped me was Wellbutrin. I'm like, okay, well, that is completely opposite to what this report has to say. So, you know,
Exactly.
you
Uh,
gotta try stuff.
right. And I
Yeah.
was hoping we could dive a little bit deeper into the science behind it because you mentioned something in your course, which I'll add a link to that in the show notes for anybody who wants to get. It's a 2 hour class that I found really informative. But you were talking about the 5-HT1AR and the
Mm-hmm.
2A, and I felt like that was the coolest thing about microdosing and psilocybin and LSD.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm a little bit of a science nerd, so I'm so happy you asked about this. Talking specifically about our serotonergic psychedelics, meaning the psychedelics that affect serotonin signaling,
Mhm.
that's going to be our psilocybin and our LSD. I know I've tangentially mentioned microdosing ketamine. That's a whole other that's a whole other ball of wax. That's glutamate. So just talking about the serotonin ones. There are many different kinds of serotonin receptors throughout the body. Side note, more than 90% of the serotonin in your body is made. Do you know where? I'm putting you on the spot.
No, ma'am. Your brain?
Okay. Yeah, that's the thought, right?
Yeah.
It's made in the gut. More
Okay.
than 90% of serotonin in your body is made in your gut. And this is part of why integrative docs like me keep harping about how important it is what you put in your body, what you're
Gut
eating,
health.
yeah, exactly, your gut health.
Oh,
If you take that antibiotic, by the way, the chances of getting depression after taking an antibiotic are like kind of scary high. So, this is why we harp on gut health. Super important for serotonin production. So after you've got that serotonin, for it to do its magic tricks, it has to bind to receptor sites for serotonin. And because our bodies are sophisticated and highly complex, beautiful things, we don't just have one kind of serotonin receptor. We have many kinds of serotonin receptors and then subtypes of those types. So, of the many, I'm only going to harp on two for the purposes of this conversation. I'm going to harp on the 5-HT1A receptor and the 5-HT2A receptor. So, what the 1A receptor does This is the receptor that is going to be modulated by our SSRIs, by our prescription pharmaceutical medications that affect our serotonin levels. Or drugs like fluoxetine or Prozac, our Lexapro fall into this category. So when you have activity at the 5-HT1A receptor, you can get, oh my gosh, so helpful. When people say that antidepressants don't work, I'm going to be the first to go to bat and say, no, they absolutely do for some people. Mm-hmm. They absolutely do. And the way that they work is by binding these 5-HT1A receptors, is they help you with resilience and something called your emotional blunting response. And what that means is that when something hurts your feelings, you go, ouch, instead of collapsing into a puddle on the floor, crying for 3 days, right? So there's a kind of blunting or a kind of toning down of the emotional response. And what that does is it helps you tolerate the things that are hard in your life. It helps increase your patience. It helps increase your resilience. It's almost like putting shocks on a car. Like, life can be really hard. Life can be a bumpy road, right? And if you're driving in a car without shocks down a bumpy road, that's a very different experience than driving down a bumpy road in a car that has good shocks, right?
Right.
And so that 5-HT1A response, it's shocks on a car. Absolutely valuable. Mm-hmm. That is what most of our pharmaceutical antidepressant drugs are going to do for you if they affect serotonin. What our psychedelic drugs like psilocybin and LSD are going to do, they're going to bind to a different serotonin receptor. They're going to bind to the 2A receptor. And what the 2A receptor does is it helps you adapt. It helps you change. It helps you learn things. It helps you unlearn things. It helps you work through. So if the 1A receptor is like putting shocks on your car, so you can go down that bumpy road and it hurts less, the 2A receptor goes, wait a minute, why am I driving on this bumpy road when the freeway is just right over here and is like a way smoother, faster ride? Right? It helps you change. Whether that's changing yourself or your situation, person to person. And so what we essentially have here with our serotonergic psychedelics, we don't have more of the same. We have drugs that work in a completely different way than the pharmacological options that we have. And sometimes people ask me, well, which one's better? And a lot of folks who are coming, for example, medical doctors, psychiatrists, when they're coming from the conventional model, they say, oh, okay, well, the 1A receptor activity has got to be better because this is our tried and true, right? And then we've got people in the counterculture who say, no, the 5-HT2A, the 2A is going to be better because, the pharmaceuticals don't work. And it's not about putting up with your crappy life. It's about fixing your crappy life so that it's not a crappy life, right? And I'm sort of this middle path where I go, wait a minute, I think we need both. I think we absolutely need both. Because if you are a single mother and you have 3 kids and you have major depressive disorder, you can't change that. You can't undo the 3 kids.
Right. They're there.
Right. Right. I mean, if you want to undo the 3 kids, please talk to a professional. We will get you help. That is a completely different medical condition, right? To be taken very seriously. But you can't change the fact that climate change exists. You can't change the fact that there are taxes, right? Sometimes you just got to be able to grin and bear the thing that's hard, right? Or sometimes you got to go, okay, I'm a single mother to 3 kids, and I have been working in this job over here because in my upbringing, my dad told me that I would only be lovable if I, whatever, was this kind of a worker. But actually, my passion is a complete career change. I want to start my own business, and my dad thinks it's crazy. But you know what? I think I can pull it off. And then that single mother goes and starts her own business, and she starts bringing in 6 figures, and she can get a nicer place, and she can afford to hire a nanny, right? She's still a single mom, and there are still the challenges of being a single mom, but she's essentially just made life a lot easier for herself. So maybe both are important.
I see them both. Like which tool's more useful, a hammer or a saw? And it's like, well, it really depends what you need it for.
Right? It's
So
both.
I think it's just another tool in the toolbox, and it's got its applicabilities.
Yeah. A couple of other things worth mentioning here on in terms of how microdosing works. And all of this is like with the big asterisks and a giant footnote that says we don't know, but here's what we think
Right.
based on the research that we have so far is you know, if it is these microscopic or even, people joke it's a homeopathic dose. Well,
Mhm.
if it's at such a small dose, why does it work? Well, when we consider how sensitive these receptors are, serotonin receptors and other neurotransmitter receptors in the brain, given the importance of serotonin, it's likely that even small doses can affect us. And there's also newer study now showing that it's actually not just the communication from cell to cell, but the intracellular signaling, meaning the communication happening within a cell,
Mhm.
right? There's a correlation between a drug's ability to cross a cell membrane and its ability to engender positive changes on our health. So the new hypothesis is that these microdoses are actually doing intracellular receptor activation. They're not just binding on the surface of the cells, but actually doing some changes within the cells. And what we see, or what's theorized here, is that when individuals microdose, because of that intracellular binding and that cascade, we see something called neuroplasticity, which refers to the nervous system's ability to essentially rewire itself, to create new connections, to learn new tricks, or to go, hey, this trick over here that we've been doing for 3 decades, that's based on a faulty formula that isn't true. Let's
Hmm.
stop doing that. Let's
Yeah.
break that. And instead, let's make a new connection over here. And that's really important for really any mental health condition that has any element of redundancy or stuckness to it, is our brains are just playing the same patterns over and over again, and those patterns are wrong. And
Mm.
even if we can consciously understand that the patterns are wrong, how do you go about breaking those patterns? How do you go about creating new patterns?
Right.
This is where microdosing can be helpful. And then the last thing I want to say, just in terms of the sciencey stuff, is that based on animal studies, but 5-HT, the 2A activation, meaning what psilocybin and LSD does, even at subbehavioral levels, has been shown to be anti-inflammatory. And when we look at a lot of these mental health conditions that people struggle with, especially the people who have PTSD,
Mhm.
these folks are grappling with the damage of inflammation in their brains and in their nervous systems. And an inflamed brain is an angry brain, is an anxious brain, is a sad brain, is an ADHD brain,
Mhm.
is a stuck in a PTSD loop brain. What all these conditions have in common is inflammation, chronic inflammation.
That's cool. So, anti-inflammation, wouldn't that lead to more serotonin?
It absolutely could, right? So
Awesome.
and then we've got our virtuous cycle here,
Right. Awesome.
right?
The
Yeah.
neuroplasticity was something I thought was really cool, and I'm going to loop it in with you mentioned some incidental findings in your class in migraine clusters, PMS, as well as TBI. I have
Mhm.
TBI, so I think it'd be super interesting to see a study between like the neuroplasticity aspect of psilocybin LSD and maybe like a cognitive rehabilitation program, because
Oh,
I think the
absolutely.
combination of those two would be really interesting. Because I have friends that, we're bomb squad, so we were around a lot of explosions, and it's caused issues with traumatic brain issues and cognitive abilities. And I think that that would be really cool. And I thought it was a really
Mm.
cool connection.
Yeah. Well, and when you look at the effects of TBI, it's not just how you think and feel. If you have a traumatic brain injury,
Mhm.
I mean, the organ that initiates all of your endocrine response, your entire kind of cascade of hormone production in your body, is your hypothalamus and your pituitary in your
Yeah.
brain. right? So individuals with a traumatic brain injury, once you've disrupted that hypothalamic pituitary axis, you get hypothyroidism, right? The thyroid
Hmm.
doesn't work as properly because the thyroid gets its signal from the brain. The most common organic cause of depression is hypothyroidism.
That's crazy.
And then what we also see in fellas is hypogonadism, that low testosterone picture. And low
Mm.
T is all the rage now. Where does low T come from? In the developed world, usually it's not a problem with the testicles. It's a problem with the brain not properly signaling the testes to
Yeah.
make testosterone, right?
Hmm.
Well, where does that come from? TBI, right? And so when we have a therapy that has the potential to wake up the brain, to rehabilitate the brain, to allow the brain to create new neural connections and grow new synapses so that the brain can essentially work more effectively, this has significant therapeutic potential, not only for ADD, ADHD, depression, anxiety, not just for how you think and feel, but also how your physical body actually functions.
That's cool. No, I
Yeah,
love it. Are these drugs addictive?
that is an amazing question. Um, Physiologic. So anything can be addictive,
Right.
right? Apple seeds can be addictive.
Hmm.
There are different pathways of addiction. When we talk about whether or not substances are addictive, we're typically referring to their physiological potential for addiction, right?
Right.
So can you like chemically get hooked on these things? And the answer for LSD and psilocybin is no. They have not been shown to be physiologically addictive.
Mm.
What we do find is there are some risks. Um, in particular, every tool is a weapon, right? It depends on how you wield it. Depending on how you use psilocybin and LSD, in particular at the higher doses, they can be powerful tools for transformation, therapeutic breakthrough, and healing, or they can just be really fun and novel ways of like checking out,
Yeah.
right? You can just trip out and kind of bypass
Live.
the things going on in your life, right?
Yeah.
And we do see that happening. And we definitely do see the people who are hitting these substances pretty hard in a recreational capacity, who probably are using them as a bypass, frankly. And are they addicted? I mean, chemically speaking, probably not,
Mhm.
but socially speaking, sure. Yeah, absolutely. And so having some mindfulness around how it's used. The other thing that we can see happen is a certain tolerance can build up to these substances.
Mm.
We only have one study on this, but for that reason, based on the data available, it seems like with psilocybin, if you're microdosing psilocybin, no, not a tolerance buildup. With LSD, it seems like after 3 days, 3 consecutive days of use, a tolerance builds up. And that's why with a lot of the microdosing protocols you see out there, or I think pretty much all of the microdosing protocols I've come across, there are scheduled breaks
Mm.
in the protocols. So, for example, one protocol has you taking the the substance 1 day on, 2 days off. That's the Fadiman protocol developed by James Fadiman, where maybe you'll take LSD on a Sunday, microdose,
Mhm.
and then you don't do it again until Wednesday. And then you don't do it again until Sunday, right? You've got a 2 day break in between your dosing days. Another protocol is the Stamets protocol by Paul Stamets, the famous mycologist. He suggests doing this is for mushrooms, 4 days in a row, and then 3 days off. So, maybe if you work a typical Monday to Friday week, maybe you microdose Monday through Thursday, and then you take Friday, Saturday, Sunday off. So you
Mm.
build some breaks in to just prevent that tolerance from developing.
Right.
Tolerance is not the same thing as dependency.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
I've seen, had a friend, we did a hero dose, and the next day his tolerance was as if psilocybin had no impact whatsoever in his life. And I was like,
Wow.
wow, I've never seen anyone do that. But it's a tangent. Sorry.
No, the tangents are all they're all fascinating in this industry. So it's all good.
So I've read if you have I guess, either issues yourself with schizophrenia, or if you have direct like parents that have it, you're anything like that. Like, I was curious, negatives. What are some things that you should be mindful of before you even consider checking out psilocybin or LSD? And I know that that was one that I
Mm.
read about. I was just curious if there's any others.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, and I appreciate you bringing that up. So there's a lot that we don't know about these substances
Hmm.
being used in a microdose capacity. And even a lot of the studies that we do have on psilocybin and LSD, they're at bigger dose ranges. And to take a substance at a large dose range a handful of times in your life is very different than taking it at a low dose, more than half of the days out of the month.
Hmm.
And so what we don't know a lot about, but we know enough to be concerned and to say proceed with caution or don't proceed at all, is individuals with the opposite of brain rigidity. These mental health conditions that are characterized by brain chaos, brain disorganization. We see that in individuals with mania, such as those who have bipolar, especially bipolar 1 disorder, and individuals with personal history of psychosis or a strong family history of psychosis.
Hmm.
And what mania and psychosis have in common is that the brain is very disorganized, meaning the neurochemical activity is all over the place. And part of how these drugs work is by introducing small amounts of chaos into the brain.
Hmm.
And when we look at, the opposite end of the mental health spectrum, conditions like depression, conditions like OCD, conditions like, I've got PTSD and now I've got hypervigilance, that is an excess of rigidity in the brain. The brain created a pattern based on faulty data. It created a law that is not good, that it's not a good law. It's not a
Hmm.
true law. And then the brain keeps playing that script over and over and over again and reinforces that pattern. And then a psychedelic comes and disorganizes the pattern. And then we get to have our aha moments. But when your brain's already disorganized, you really don't need to go disrupting that already disorganized
Right.
state to make it more, right? And so I am going on record to say I have absolutely seen microdosing push people into manic states.
Really?
Yes.
Mm. That's
And people
terrifying.
don't like it when I say that, but I have to say it because I've seen it happen.
Right.
And these were people who, it wasn't like, oh, Johnny was a completely normal guy and then he started microdosing and then he had a psychotic break. No, those were not the situations.
Mm.
They were situations like this person already had some signs of maybe hypomania.
Hmm.
They were going through a really stressful time, just found out that, actually this literally happened with one of my clients. His father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He was
Mm.
really close with his father. He lost his job at around the same time. He starts microdosing. He gets manic. Then he's on the roof looking for antennas on the roof because he thinks the government is listening to conversations he's having in his house.
Wow.
Yeah. So this is new, right? And
Yeah.
so what I and my colleagues do, and we're by no means the only people who do this, but at Right to Heal, the nonprofit where I work and I'm the executive director, is we encourage people, make an appointment with us, with myself or one of the other doctors on our team. Check in, have a 15-minute Zoom call with us once a month, just so that you've got a professional who has eyes on you,
That's
eyes and
awesome.
ears on you, checking in. How's it going? No, we're not in your living room, right? It's over Zoom.
Hmm.
There are limitations. But if we hop on a call and suddenly you're talking a lot faster and you look like you haven't showered in 3 days, and this is not the person that we remember you were at the baseline, we'll tell you, like, hey, this isn't going well.
Yeah.
It's time to slow this train down.
I like it.
And the other thing on safety, before I'm going to change the subject on safety, so
Mhm.
I'll let you go first.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say, I think mental health check-ins are one of the most important things to have, even if you feel like everything's going great. Having that
Yeah.
person you go to all the time, just like a physical doctor, like you go in, they check your blood work. I think having that person to be like, hey, how am I? Like this is what I'm feeling, thinking, and doing, and just have that person who's consistent and be like, yeah, it seems like everything's going well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It can be really helpful, especially because so much of this work is stigmatized.
Yes.
And for better or worse, people keep it a secret that they're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And especially if you're doing this and you're keeping it a secret, you should have someone, you know,
Yeah.
once a month, once every 2 months, just someone who's kicking the tires, who's looking out for you,
Yep.
you know?
I agree.
The other thing on safety, and we don't know about this yet, and it is theoretical, but potentially serious, is this 5-HT2A agonism that we get with microdosing. You've also got 2A receptors on the heart. And there's a theoretical concern that if you get repeated agonism of those receptors, that you could start in a bad way disrupting your cardiac health.
Mm.
And an example of a drug that did this was, I don't know if you remember the drug fen-phen, which was a weight loss drug.
I do. Yeah.
This is why a lot of people who do, and fen-phen has since been pulled from the market because a lot of people got into harm's way in terms of their cardiac health.
Oh, wow.
And the mechanism of that was 5-HT2A agonism. Now, fen-phen is a completely different drug, right? Than psilocybin or LSD. It's an upper, it's way more stimulating. It, probably binds with stronger affinity to those receptors. We need more data.
Right.
But nevertheless, people with cardiac conditions might not be essentially you're guinea pigging. Mm-hmm. Really, anyone who's listening to this, you are guinea pigging if you microdose, because none of this is FDA approved. Yep. Right? It's only based on like data across thousands of people across the world.
And the only ones that really provide data like that, usually it's either really positive or really negative. So you're not going to have any of them in the middle. I have one more question, and we're coming up on the end of our time. But it was about the flow state. I don't know if this is a wild question, but it's been coming up a few times in my circles with jiu-jitsu and sports related stuff. And they talk about flow state and how microdosing can help assist getting into that. And I was just wondering if you had any experience or knowledge for that.
Yeah. I mean, flow states alone are so healing in terms of just pressing back into life, getting that momentum, feeling absorbed, engaged, excited by what you're working on. And microdosing does seem to help people with that, even with athletes kind of clicking into their flow state. And a lot of people when they start entering hypomanic or manic episodes, think that it's a flow state. And it's not, right? So if you have scattershot or fleeting attention, if you can't focus on what's going on, right? If you've got irritability, if you're not sleeping, if you're not eating, you've passed the threshold. You're not in flow anymore. Yeah. You're entering hypomania. And it's time to stop microdosing. It's time to eat, even if you're not hungry. And it's time to sleep. And that may mean taking medication to make yourself sleep, working with your provider, and making sure that you rest and restabilize. Right. Awesome. But those flow states. I mean, some people microdose on their work days so that they can work better at work. Other people microdose on the weekends so that they can get out their sketch pad and make art, or pull out the guitar and play on the guitar and reconnect with those things that you do that are just for you, that serve no practical purpose other than to help you love being alive and connect with your source energy. Yeah. Right.
My favorite is microdosing going for a hike.
Yeah, exactly. Very popular, and actually, I'm like joking, very popular combination. But actually, when we think about these things as medicine, that is called synergism, right?
Right.
When you are using 1 + 1, 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. 1 + 1 is 11, right? And how many studies do we have showing that time in nature has positive outcomes for mental health?
So many.
A lot, right? So many. So then if you're stacking microdosing on top of time in nature, like, wow.
Yep.
That's amazing, right? And we have similar study findings on for chronic pain. Also, microdosing seems to help with chronic pain. this is why another reason it could be so helpful for the veteran population, right? How
Yeah.
many veterans have endured physical, not just mental, emotional injury, but physical injury, right? And chronic pain is a real booger because chronic pain actually has very little to do with the physical body. It's a bad habit of the nervous system that continues to send and perceive a pain signal, even in the absence of a physical injury still being there, right? And so if you can disrupt that patterning and then you synergize it with something like a yoga class, or a yoga class in the woods, right?
Now you got 111.
Right? Now yeah, exactly. Now you've really taken it to, and so just on this note of there not being a magic pill, like even with all of the potential and the promise that microdosing holds, don't just lean too hard on that one tool because you've got many available to you.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it. That's all the questions I have. I just want to give you an opportunity to maybe wrap up anything that you think is important or relevant that maybe we didn't touch on yet.
Let me just scroll through real quick. My notes. I know we've gone strong a lot. Give me a sec.
Yeah. No, that's all my questions for sure.
I think we covered a lot of it.
Yeah. I mean, there's a few things that like stacking, stamina stack. It felt like that's a really neat thing, but
I can talk about that real quick if you want.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'll let you pose the question and then.
Okay. The other one was going to be stacking because you mentioned 1 + 1 is 11 and the stamina stack, and I thought that was pretty interesting because it's not just microdosing, but it's microdosing with other natural substances to increase the benefits or potential benefits of psilocybin or LSD.
Yeah. Stacking is a real interesting one and it's like we're talking about a topic that we don't have a lot of data, and then as we get into the subtopics, it's like even less data. Right. So last I checked, I've seen one published study from 2022 on stacking. And what's stacking? Let's just define stacking. It means taking a microdose of psilocybin mushrooms with lion's mane, mycelium, which is another kind of mushroom that has shown some promise in the treatment of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and niacin, which is vitamin B3. Yes, the kind that makes you flush. And the thought is that you get the synergistic effect of these two different mushroom species, both of which seem to just love the nervous system. And then what the niacin does, and yes, it has to be the flushing kind, 50 to 200 milligrams of niacin, it essentially increases that permeability so that the peripheral nerves can take up the mushroom medicine more effectively. And so in this one study that I'm aware of, a 2022 study following people over 30 days, stacking did actually not seem to have any benefit over just regular microdosing in terms of mood. But what it did significantly show improvement in was for psychomotor skills, in particular for people above the age of 55. So what they found is that those people who were above the age of 55 who did stacking had better things like eye-hand coordination, throwing, catching a ball, driving a car, typing, playing a musical instrument. I'm not recommending microdosing and driving a car. I'm not going to do that. But people do it.
Yep.
So that's the data we have. So sometimes another thing to consider is, if you've tried microdosing, or if a hypothetical person has hypothetically tried microdosing, and let's say they tried microdosing LSD and it didn't do much for them. And then they tried microdosing psilocybin, it didn't do much for them. Another try could be microdosing psilocybin within the Stamets stack formula, taking lion's mane, taking 50 milligrams of niacin and the dried psilocybin mushrooms all together and seeing what that does.
Awesome. No, I really appreciate the information. And the last thing, I was just going to say, where can we get more information, more of you? How can we help? Or how can we, I don't know,
How do we keep in touch?
Yeah, exactly.
Spread the good word.
Yes.
Thank you for asking. Well, I am Erica Zelfand. My last name is a doozy, but if you can spell it, Zelfand, drzelfand.com is my website. I'm also the executive director of Right to Heal. We're a nonprofit organization specializing in integrative mental health. We do talk about microdosing. We do talk about the things that other doctors won't talk about. And we are at righttoheal.com, and that's RIGHT, because healing is the right choice. And it's also your right to make that choice. And we've got your back.
I love it. And I will tag you in absolutely everything that you just mentioned in the show notes, as well as any of the creatives that we create with it.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you so much for the honor of being able to be here and connecting with your community.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And with that, we'll wrap it up.